Groovy. Well, I guess that's one way to spoof the ending of the Evil Dead remake. Um, so yeah, as you can tell by the little title at the bottom here, up 1 second. Ah, excuse me. If I was Ash, maybe I had a beer or something. Anyway, so this is the my review for the 2013 remake of the 1981 classic, The Evil Dead. And in order to review this movie properly, there are going to be a lot of compare and contrasts with how this movie does the scary dark house trope versus the original. And for those of you who are watching this video in the Bruce Campbell fan club on Facebook, Matt Burke, when I told people in that fan club that I was going to do this, I'm going to take a page out of your book and talk about the good things about the movie, because there are some things in there that are good, but I feel like in terms of the scale, the good stuff versus the bad stuff, it's like this. There are some good things about the movie. And honestly, I will say this. I'll talk about the good things first. For one thing, the setup for the film is very good. The idea that the cabin that our main characters are in is was actually an old cabin that was owned by by David and Mia, two of the five, six, seven main two of the five main characters. So that actually makes a little more sense why they would be in this cabin, because it's something that is in their family and they're staying in it for a bit with their friends. Because that was one thing that was always kind of confusing about the original. Because they go to this cabin that's way up in the hills, a little run down. But the problem is, even though in the original you know they're renting it for spring break, it still doesn't make any sense why they'd want to rent it in the first place. I mean, yeah, you're getting it for a good, cheap deal, but what are you expecting to do up there? You know? I mean, if it was just Ash and Linda and then Scotty and Sheila, if it was just those four, then I could assume they were gonna have a crazy weekend of thrills up there. But when you have your sister, when Ash has his sister Cheryl up there, it's kind of like, well, what are you guys? It doesn't make it makes sense how they got the cabin, but it doesn't make sense why they'd want to get the cabin. I mean, saying you want something because it's cheap can only explain so much and justify very little, you know? So that's one positive that the remake has over the original. And I do like how the setup in this movie is basically about the main character Mia trying to kick a drug addiction, and it does lead into my one criticism I have of the movie, but I'm not done with the good stuff yet. So I do like how from the get-go you're trying to create an uncomfortable situation with the characters. And I also like how there's a lot of references to the original movies, like the evil force blasting through the woods chasing after the would-be victims, the Oldsmobile that's kind of wrecked and not much more than a burned out skeleton by the house. So I like that. I like the referencing of the chainsaw, and I like how this movie is a combination of the first two Evil Dead movies, because Mia does kind of become the female Ash of the movie, because she does suffer from the. She's actually a combination of Ash and Cheryl, because she does get victimized by the evil the same way Cheryl does in the original movie. She does get possessed and unpossessed repeatedly throughout the film, and she also has becomes the chainsaw wielding hero with the one-liners at the very end. And the one liner she gives at the end where the demon is saying, I'll feast on your soul, and she's like, feast on this, sucker. And then she just shoves the chainsaw through the creature's head. That was very much akin to the bit in Evil Dead 2 where Ash is fighting off Henrietta. The demon starts taunting him, saying, I'll swallow your soul. And then Ash is just like, swallow this. So there are some references and there are some callbacks. And it took me about 5 minutes just to get through the positive stuff. So let's see how my first big downgrade with the uncomfortable setup for this movie is that before we even meet our main characters, they basically say that this cabin is already bad news by having a prologue of this demon possessed girl getting incinerated and her head blasted off by her dad in the very beginning. And it's like that's kind of my first downgrade of the movie, because in the first film, when the characters are going to the cabin, you don't really know what you're in for. I mean, they do find the book and the recording and some other loot in the basement that could be some use to them. But I don't think it's been a long time since I saw the first Evil Dead movie, but I do remember it very well. I don't think the Book of the Dead even shows up until like almost almost at the start of the second act. It's like I think it's somewhere between the end of the first third and the start of the second third that the book even makes an appearance. And the the character relationships were also very shallow and very flimsily constructed. They're not weak. It's just a lot of it is explained in dialogue. We don't really get to see it, and it just feels like it doesn't flesh out the characters. If you're trying to flesh out your characters, you can't just have them talk about their past lives and what their story is, and then have us get completely invested in them. There's still some very good acting all around. Mia and Eric are by far the best characters in the movie, because the actors really sell what the characters are going through. David, Natalie, and Olivia, I think those are the other three. They don't really have a personality, and that's if they really wanted to make this an uncomfortable setup and about the redemption of David reconnecting with his friends and his sister, you would have to have a you'd have to have more character development, because I feel like this is much like a comedy where there's all set up for a punchline but no real payoff. And that's the thing with the characters. There's a lot of setup that isn't that powerful, but there's no punchline. It's basically like reading a trading card game or a video game bio of the character in the game. You know, in the original, the characters maybe a little cartoony, but they had defined characters. Ash was kind of a shy wimp. Scotty was this wisecracking guy who could be a bit of a dick sometimes. Cheryl was the scared, reserved one. Sheila, I don't really remember. I mean, but even for Cheryl, even for Sheila and Linda, who didn't have a lot of character in the original movie, I still remember them more, because I remember them more when they were evil and they were trying to kill their friends. And I also feel like that with the Deadites, that they had a good idea of making the Deadites in this movie more foul mouthed than they were in the original. But the problem is, the Deadites in those movies, not only do they enjoy torturing and maiming our characters, but they're also supposed to be kind of joking with us. Like they like abusing and hurting humans, but they also like screwing with us in the process. So I feel like if they added that in there to the movie, that would have made things better. And I feel like with this remake, I feel like it's a generic horror movie with some of the trappings of the Evil Dead. And yeah, the gore effects in this movie are much better than the first, but the first movie had so much going against it financially. This one has a much higher budget, so of course the gore effects are going to look better. And I feel like the one thing that this wasn't a dead idea from the start, but I think this movie had a lot to prove. Because you're going up against a cult classic that's beloved by so many horror fans, started a huge horror film franchise, has one of the most iconic characters in movie history. It's really hard to make one movie that's going to stack up against a trilogy plus all the spin-off video games and such, with or without Bruce Campbell being involved. And it's so hard because people are so married to this being the Bruce Campbell series that got him going. So if you're going to do a remake of this, you really need to make sure that you're doing something not necessarily better, but something that can hold a candle to the original. And I kind of look at this one the same way I look at the Footloose remake, which is nice try, just didn't quite cut it. And I think it's very of all, and it's really when they do find the Book of the Dead. In the first movie, they find the Book of the Dead and they listen to a recording of Professor Noby that does summon the spirits. But in the remake, when they see the book, that Eric, the smart guy, reads through it, and there's literally words in English saying, "Do not read this. You will pay for that. There is hell coming for you." And he still decides to read it and translate it. And it's like, if you're supposed to be the smart person of the group, wouldn't it make more sense if you translated it, said, "I'm not reading this out loud," have one of the friends read it stupidly, and then it starts going. It's just, I mean, I know that horror movie characters are not necessarily renowned for their intelligence, especially if they're just there to die in the movie, but this is this is just cartoonishly stupid. I mean, there could have been a way that the evil could have been released in a way that made sense, because in the first movie there was no warnings in the Book of the Dead. They just listened to the recording and they accidentally unleashed it. This one you can completely blame on Eric and his curiosity. And yeah, the only character in this movie that I felt bad about, and I actually cried a little bit when the character died, was when the dog died. That was pain. That was sad. I feel like this movie could have gone a little further with the dark, messed up stuff, but it never really did. It didn't go far. It went far enough in some places, and then other places it didn't really go that far at all. So I do kind of feel like that Mia. I really liked Mia as the hero, but again, I feel like if there was more development and more diving into her drug addiction instead of just saying, "Oh, addicted to heroin," I feel like this movie had great ideas, had good seeds for a beautiful tree to grow, but the seeds were planted and they didn't really care much for the little sprout that was coming out of the ground. I feel like if there was more development and more complexity to the movie, I think it would have been as good as The Evil Dead. But they just kind of wanted to go straight for the simple story and they just kind of dumbed it down a bit. But and my favorite part, which I referenced in the beginning, was well, aside from Mia killing the monster, was the cameo that Bruce Campbell has at the end where he just says, groovy, but yeah, the bottom line, the original is way better. The remake was a very good attempt at recreating the original. It just didn't go far enough as the original did, and it didn't really do anything that different or that special. So hopefully you guys can take that as you will. If you're wondering whether you should see the remake or not, if you've seen the Evil Dead movies but you haven't seen the remake, I would say give it a try and see if it, leaves a better impact on you than it did me. If you haven't seen any of the Evil Dead movies, I would say that definitely look up the original three first and then watch the remake. Because if you watch the remake, you'll probably get scared of it, but I think you should know what they're trying to represent with the remake. So I would say, definitely watch the original trilogy first before you see the remake. You haven't seen either of the movies. So, well, I managed to talk about this for almost 14 minutes. So, see you guys on Monday with my next cover.